have a question down here. Thanks, Libby.
Seeing no one else put their hands up. First of all, thank you very, very much, Auntie Denise, Tali and Chris. My question comes actually from my work, and I would like to ask, I actually know the answer, but I'd love to be part of a group that would sit down with First Nations people and look at the Australian Values Statement. And I wonder if either of you, Auntie Denise or Tali, have ever looked at the Australian Values Statement, which is something that any person on a visa application has to agree to, and when you do your citizenship test you have to adhere to. Of course, one part of that is the importance of the English language, not the First Peoples language. And I think we could really learn a lot of what you've talked about tonight and putting that up against what the Australian Values Statement is, and perhaps add to it the voice of the First Nations people. So it's really not a question but a statement.
Okay. Well, we'll try and take that statement as a question. Does anyone want to respond to that? Thanks, Auntie Denise.
I'll have a go at it.
Yep, good on you.
All peoples are Indigenous to somewhere. So when people come to this country, one thing that, it is my hope that we can sit down and talk about and listen to each other and respect each other's stories. It's the one thing that's been missing in our, Australian society, really, is to hear the story of the other. And people all have a story, and it's important that they get to tell their story. I love and value cultures. We went past the Korean shop, a little Korean barbecue place. It's just over the road from where I'm staying at Uniting Communities up the road. And I didn't know it was there, but I said, Harley, we're going to come to this tomorrow because, it's just an opportunity to share each other's cultures and hear each other's stories. I think that's when we hear, and it's about time too, it's about sitting down and giving the other time to be able to talk and listen. We do invite people to come walking on country with us. And I'm currently working with the cold communities in our South Australian Synod to come walking on country with me or down at Nudinjeri country or here in Ghana country to hear the story of the land because Australia is like one gigantic storybook. I keep saying, there's a story to every inch of the land, and you get to hear that story when you get to know. The way to hear that story is got to get to know the First Peoples who know the story, and they might tell you the story. Might. It's on relationships. It's about building respectful relationships. Yeah.
Thank you, Auntie Denise. And for those who didn't understand what the cold communities are, that's culturally and linguistic diverse communities in the Uniting Church. We have all these little acronyms and things like that. So many of which are people who have come as refugees or at least resettling as immigrants from another land. Thank you for your question. Oh.
And I guess the one thing that I would say too is that many people coming to this country would be able to empathise with First Peoples stories.
Yep.
That's the one thing that's missing in our society is the ability to empathise. We get people who sympathise, but that really doesn't scratch the surface. It really doesn't help us much. When you've been through it and you know it, the loss of children, the loss of land, the loss of culture. When you've been through it yourself, you know, and you know what the situations might be different, but the pain is you've experienced the pain of loss. Australia is going through that now. Whether we're listening or not, we are going through it. People who have lost everything through the floods, people who have lost everything through the bushfires, are experiencing pain at loss, total loss. We need to be listening to that.
Thank you. Another question? Thank you, Judith.
I'm speaking as an ally of the Uluru Statement. And my question is primarily to Chris, because he brought this question forward for me. But Denise or Tali might have things to say about it as well. It's about the complex relationship between differing notions of sovereignty and the asserted or the assertion that treaty will deal with that. Chris, you talked about the fact that we now have nations coexisting in the same space here in this land with differing and possibly not compatible views of sovereignty. My question is, what kind of treaty could deal with that? What would be the terms of such a treaty? Who would it be made by and with whom? And why would we have unquestioning faith in the power of treaty to deal with these issues, given how unsuccessful treaties have been in other places?
Simple questions. You're quite right. I mean, I think the argument's about the basis for the claim to sovereignty. So in part, the movement towards treaty, without solving the basis for, is at least willing to acknowledge that there's a form of sovereignty of some kind that allows people to negotiate as nations. So we may not have solved the whole thing, but I think the movement is towards saying we recognise enough sovereignty to allow us to have a conversation. And there are parallels. I mean, New Zealand, Canada, the United States work on those assumptions, and they all work with different kinds of understandings of sovereignty. So I think there's enough foundation there to allow that to have a treaty conversation, that is a conversation about recognising each other enough to sit down at a table. Well, they won't solve all the problems. We know that treaties are normally formed as a result of the end of strife and often are imposed on somebody because of that. Tomorrow I want to talk more about treaties, because I think understood biblically there's ways that are more creative around that. But I think what the Canadian experience is that treaties that were made and then forgotten are now being brought to the forefront, and because they're legal entities, people are now going back to them and forcing governments, as they are in New Zealand, to deal with those issues. So there's a foundation, at least in law, for a conversation that, even when it's not perfect, there's something to be done. Yeah, I'm a bit hopeful and a bit cynical, that's me.
Thank you, and thank you for the question. Anybody else? Right over here, we're keeping you busy, Al.
I was deeply touched by both Talia and Denise, and I was thinking about ancient stories and the importance of ancient stories, and could we challenge our faith traditions that the ancient stories of Australia are part of our sacred scripture, as much as the New Testament, as much as the scriptures in church. Denise, you said that if we don't listen, and if we didn't listen as children, it is about life and death. And I think to choose life, maybe our faith traditions need to introduce a concept of looking at the Australian story as sacred scripture in this country. Would you like to make a comment to that?
Yeah, I guess how I've, how my faith and spirituality has grown over the years, I recognise that God didn't come to this land on the endeavour. God was already here in creation. And we have our creation stories. Aboriginal people have our stories of how that hill was made, or that's what makes them a sacred site. And that's why there's so much pain associated when a mountain is gouged out for the sake of minerals, and when things are just land is used for development and not really taking into account that God is in the land. Our name for God is Arawatana, Most High, and that's why I use that name now. In my prayers and in my songs that I sing, I use the name for God, Most High. It's interesting that, and Chris would know, be able to tell the story much better, but Melchizedek, and when Abraham came into the land of Canaan, was it Canaan? I've got to just check with Chris. But he was greeted in the name of El Elyon. Melchizedek, the indigenous king, came out and gave an indigenous blessing in his language in the name of El Elyon, the indigenous name for God. And Abraham accepted it and gave gave Melchizedek his gifts, a tenth of everything that he had owned, and or he had plundered in battle. And so the church has much to learn about Aboriginal spirituality. The fact that our stories, we need to ask ourselves the question, where is God in our story? And so whenever I tell a story to my kids at home, I always ask them the question, where is Arawatana? Where is God in that story? And we need to ask that of ourselves in our stories, our church stories that we, and in our New Testament stories. Where is God in that story? Not just read the story of the scriptures, but where is God in that story, and where are we in that story? And so the other thing, I've just lately, with my theologian in residence hat, I thought I'd come to this with my Indigenous spirituality hat on, knowing that Aboriginal people, to bring a knowledge of Aboriginal spirituality to the wider church. As it turned out, the other thing that's happened for me during this time now is that to recognise that Second Peoples also have Indigenous spirituality, but we've largely forgotten the heritage of our ancestral stories. And later on in the year, we're having a Cornish spirituality retreat at Moonta to to hear the ancestral stories of the Cornish people, and also to have a dialogue with the Narungga peoples. I'm hoping that to get in touch with the Narungga peoples and have that dialogue with them. I guess one thing I've also come to understand is that the Old Testament is the old people's story. It's the ancestral stories of the Jewish people. It's their ancestral stories of how God was with them. And they told their stories, and we need to understand that you can't have the Old Testament story, the New Testament story, without the Old Testament story. They are the one story. And so it's very important to get in touch with your ancestral stories, wherever you come from, whatever your cultural heritage. I think that that's the gift that Aboriginal spirituality can give to the wider church.
We
Can I
only
just
have...
make one comment?
Yes.
It seems to me that one of the starts for us as Christians is to understand that the Bible actually holds very contradictory stories, and it doesn't try to solve the contradiction. It says something there, and it says the opposite over there, and it just lets us stew in the opposites. And I think that creates a gap to then hear other stories, because you don't have to explain them or justify them or fit them into what we think is one story, because the Bible isn't one story. It's multiple stories that have space, if we're open to it, for other parts of the story. It's only when we close the Bible down to one story that we have no space for others.
Those gaps invite us into that sacred dialogue, that sacred storytelling. Thank you. One last question. Lily, we'll have to make this the last question, so it's yours. We've just got so much time slipped by, and we need to finish by 9:30. So thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentations, Auntie Denise and Chris and Tali. I marvel when I stand in front of the 60,000-year-old map of Australia and the many different cultures. And then I look at, or I hear how we say that we are the most successful multicultural country in the world. And those words to me are very hollow, because I think we do silo culturalism. We don't do engaged multicultural exploration of one another. And I just wonder if you can comment on how did Indigenous people maintain their separateness but yet kept themselves open to have a truly hospitable multicultural Australia long before Captain Cook came.
I think with that question comes a level of cultural capability or cultural education, and just the fact that some, just broadly, cultures, some have remained intact and others have been completely destroyed by colonisation. And I think there needs to be a grace and understanding of that by wider Australian society in some sense, and also an encouragement of cultures that are rebuilding and language that is rebuilding to continue. So I think the grace needs to come a little bit more by wider society, and remembering that this word Aboriginal is basically a colonised word, that there was, you know, somewhere upwards of 500 nations and clans and language group that existed before colonisation. But from my understanding of just being in secular society, that understanding really does need to come from wider society, because those Aboriginal people strong in their culture are going to remain strong in their culture and develop themselves. And there's some really great work all around Australia happening, but certainly Kaurna language revival, which has been huge in the past 20 years, and they've just done really well, and certainly Ngarrindjeri culture, Adnyamathanha culture, which has excelled in keeping their culture alive, but also from the teaching of elders to younger generations as well. So I think there needs to be encouragement of that to continue, and an encouragement of the wider public to continue to upskill themselves in cultural education. And that in some ways comes back to that citizenship question in a way. How do we urge the government to promote the multiculturalism of Aboriginal cultures as well, so that we don't just get this one homogenous group which doesn't exist, and that goes for culture, opinion and all the rest of it.
Yeah, and I guess a new way, a new understanding of where history begins. A new understanding of where history begins, because our history didn't just begin 200 years ago. It was definitely back. When you stand before that map of Indigenous Australia, you understand very clearly that there were many, hundreds of states in Australia, each group of people recognising respectfully their borders. And Adnyamathanha people, we were further northern people, but we had no need to go into somebody else's land. We had everything that we needed in our own country. And, we lived off the land, and most Aboriginal people did. And, they had, were self-sustaining peoples, and had law that governed everything. And so, there was a new understanding of where history begins in our country. That is a really important conversation to have too.
Thank you, Tali and Auntie Denise. We're going to have to wrap it up there.